Sylviane and Jean-Claude Muller were an ordinary couple, the kind you'd find in any quiet neighborhood in France. Sylviane was born on September 23, 1969, in Gironde, France, and Jean-Claude on April 8, 1961, in Casablanca, Morocco. They met in 1986 at a party. Sylviane was just 17, Jean-Claude 25. To avoid scaring him off, Sylviane lied about her age, claiming she was already an adult. That same night, she got into his car and, as Sylviane would say years later, they never parted again. They married on April 7, 1990, in a church ceremony. Jean-Claude, from a Jewish family, converted to Christianity to fulfill Sylviane's dream. They had 2 daughters, Natasha, born in 1993, and Margot, born January 11, 1996. They settled in Icines, a small town of about 6,000 people, 30 minutes from Bordeaux, in the Gironde, department of Nouvelle-Aquitaine. Icines is known for its peaceful vibe, close to both city and nature, with stunning spots like the Dune of Pilatte and Arcachon. Sylviane and Jean-Claude were very close and known for their generosity. Sylviane was described as kind-hearted, gentle, and always ready to help others, while Jean-Claude was outgoing, funny, and loved bringing family together to share laughs. Professionally, they had their ups and downs. In the early 2000s, Sylviane worked as a waitress at Bluebird, a nightclub run by a friend, before teaming up with Jean-Claude to open Cubano Café, a bar-restaurant in Icines, where they settled in 2005. The business, however, didn't take off, and they eventually had to close the restaurant. Sylviane then dedicated herself to being a full-time homemaker and mother, and she fell in love with breeding French bulldogs. 80% of her Facebook profile was filled with pictures of puppies. Jean-Claude, on the other hand, had a more stable career as an electrotechnician specializing in security systems. Self-taught, he installed cameras and alarms for major clients like the Part Group, the Bank of France, and the Mint in Pessac. Despite his professional success, Jean-Claude sometimes struggled financially because he was overly generous, often doing work for free for friends and acquaintances. Their life was simple and happy. They had a backyard pool, a close-knit family, and were still in love after nearly 30 years of marriage. In 2018, Sylviane underwent gastric surgery to lose weight, which gave her a renewed sense of confidence in her body. She and Jean-Claude dreamed of retirement, planning to move either to Guadeloupe, where they had last vacationed in February 2019, or to the Arcachon Bay. Sylviane was also thrilled about becoming a grandmother. Her daughter, Natasha, was pregnant and planning to name the baby Kay. Sylviane couldn't wait to spend time with her granddaughter, baking cookies and playing together. To everyone who knew them, the Mullers were the picture of love and family harmony. No enemies, no major issues, just a peaceful life. Natasha and Margot, Sylviane and Jean-Claude's daughters, were very close to their parents. Natasha, the eldest, was 26 at the time of the crime in 2019. She already had a family of her own. She lived with her partner Anthony and their daughter Kay, who was just a year and a half old at the time. Natasha lived near Icines and visited her parents almost every day, often bringing Kay to spend time with her grandparents. Margot, on the other hand, was 23 and a student in Bordeaux, single and still figuring things out. She had a very close relationship with her parents. Like many college students, Margot used Sundays to do her laundry at her parents' house and spend the day with them, a routine that tragically would turn into a nightmare on December 15, 2019. According to reports, the daughters were in contact with their parents almost daily, either through messages or visits. Natasha, for instance, described how Sylviane was the kind of mom who would post old photos on Facebook to wish them a happy birthday, always showing how loving and present she was. In later interviews, Margot mentioned that her mom was the first person she called every morning, and that losing that daily call left an enormous void in her life after the crime. Despite being in different life stages, Natasha more settled, Margot still exploring. The sisters were close and shared a deep love for their parents. On December 14, 2019, the atmosphere in Icines was typical of the holiday season. The streets were decorated with Christmas lights. Families were getting ready for the celebrations. And the air was cold. Sylviane and Jean-Claude spent the day helping some friends move. Around 8:30 p.m., they returned home at number 6 on Rue Saint-Jean in Icines. At 9 p.m., Jean-Claude called one of his sisters to talk about plans for the next day. He had agreed to help care for their elderly mother. The couple had dinner in the kitchen and, tired, went to bed around 10 p.m. Up until that moment, everything seemed normal. The next day, December 15th, 2019, around 6:40 p.m., 23-year-old Margot Muller arrived at her parents' house for her usual Sunday routine, doing laundry and spending time with them. When she got there, she noticed both of her parents' cars were in the driveway, which made her think they were home. She rang the doorbell and tried to open the door, which was locked, unusual but not enough to raise immediate concern. Margot entered the house and quickly sensed something was off. The place was completely dark except for the faint glow of the Christmas tree lights shining in the silence. There was a slight burnt smell in the air, and she figured her mom might have forgotten something in the oven. Margot called out, "Mom, Dad, are you there?" But got no answer. Suddenly, the family dog, Miss, a small French bulldog, came running toward her, visibly distressed, eyes wide, panting heavily. Miss led Margot straight to her parents' bedroom where a dim light was on. When she opened the door, Margot was hit with the worst nightmare of her life. Her father, Jean-Claude, was lying on the bed, flat on his back, eyes open, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. On the floor beside the bed was her mother, Sylviane, face down, nightgown pulled up to her waist. At first, Margot thought they were asleep or caught in an intimate moment, and she felt embarrassed. She tried to wake the Urem Anam, Giskalik, alls out Ikawauden, shaking them, but quickly realized their bodies were cold and stiff. That's when Margot looked around and fully grasped the horror. The walls were splattered with blood, the floor soaked, and even the ceiling was stained. Her parents weren't asleep. They had been brutally murdered. In shock, Margot grabbed her phone and called the police, screaming that her parents had been killed. She ran out of the house, still shouting, and tried to flag down a passing driver for help, but he didn't stop. Her screams were heard by Jeannie Robinet, a neighbor and family friend, who ran to the house and froze at the horrifying scene. Meanwhile, Margot called her sister Natasha, who lived nearby and arrived before the police. Margot stopped Natasha at the door saying, "What I saw, you can't see." Police and paramedics arrived shortly after, but there was nothing to be done. Sylviane and Jean-Claude were already dead. One officer described the scene as one of the most violent he had ever witnessed, something you see maybe once or twice in an entire career. Margot and Natasha, both in shock, were taken to Libourne Hospital, where Margot had to be admitted. The Izines community was stunned. No one could believe something so horrific could happen in such a quiet neighborhood to such a beloved couple with no known enemies. The question hanging in the air was, who could have done this? And why? 2 days after the bodies were found, on December 17th, 2019, a homicide investigation was officially opened and handed over to the Bordeaux Police Investigation Unit. The crime scene was meticulously examined by the National Gendarmerie Criminal Research Institute, a unit specializing in complex cases. At first, investigators considered the possibility that Jean-Claude had killed Sylviane and then taken his own life. However, that theory was ruled out early in the investigation. The autopsy revealed disturbing details. Jean-Claude had been stabbed more than 20 times, 10 of them directly in the heart. Sylviane had been stabbed 43 times, mostly in the chest area, with severe wounds to her torso and signs of forced sexual activity. Defensive wounds on both their arms and hands showed they had fought desperately for their lives. A crucial piece of evidence emerged. Under Sylviane's fingernails, male DNA was found, proof that she had scratched the killer during the struggle. Other key evidence was collected at the crime scene. There were no signs of forced entry. The front door didn't close properly, suggesting the killer got in without breaking in. This raised the possibility that the couple knew the attacker, or at least didn't see him as a threat. Interestingly, Despite Jean-Claude's background in security, the house had no cameras or alarms. Further proof that they felt completely safe in their home. Investigators found a male-sized red-soled shoe at the scene, along with some of Sylviane's personal belongings burned inside the oven. Both of the couple's cars had slashed tires. There was also a balloon from Bordeaux hanging on the front gate, sparking a theory that it may have been used to mark the house. But that lead went nowhere. Investigators began questioning every man in the neighborhood, collecting DNA samples from neighbors and acquaintances, a process that cost over 500,000 euros. The DNA found under Sylviane's nails was entered into the National Genetic Fingerprint Database, FNAEG, but there was no match at the time. Experts from the National Gendarmerie Criminal Research Institute, IRCGN, created a psychological profile of the killer. According to experts, the killer was a man with sadistic tendencies, likely someone who knew Sylviane and had obsessive fantasies about her. He may have been part of their immediate circle, a neighbor, friend, or acquaintance. The extreme violence inflicted on Sylviane suggested that she was the primary target, while Jean-Claude was collateral damage. Investigators explored several leads. At first, they suspected Margot since she was the one who discovered the bodies. But her state of shock and the absence of any family conflict quickly ruled her out. They then turned their attention to Natasha and her partner. But again, nothing suspicious was found. Another lead pointed to a conflict with neighbors in 2017 over a plumbing issue that damaged the Muller's house. But the matter had been resolved amicably. The theory of a crime of passion was also considered. Perhaps Sylviane had a secret lover who couldn't accept her relationship with Jean-Claude, but both daughters strongly denied that possibility. Another lead involved a couple who were friends with the Mullers. The woman was a sex worker, and Jean-Claude had reportedly been one of her clients in the past. Still, no evidence supported this theory, and it was dropped. Investigators also explored a potential connection to drug trafficking since the Cubano Café had been located in an area known for illegal activity. But, again, nothing was proven. A year after the crime, a public appeal was launched regarding a blue Peugeot seen in the area, but that too led nowhere. Months turned into years, and the investigation seemed to stall. In 2020, the global health crisis made things even harder. The investigation team was reduced from 6 officers to just 1. Margot and Natasha, already devastated by the loss of their parents, began to feel like the case was being forgotten. They were kept at a distance from the investigation, receiving very few updates and often learning new developments through the media. To keep their parents' memory alive and pressure the justice system, the sisters organized marches. The first took place on December 15th, 2020, exactly 1 year after the murders. They also began appearing in the media, giving interviews on talk shows where Margot, her voice trembling, recounted the moment she found her parents' bodies. Margot and Natasha became relentless in their pursuit of answers. They demanded more resources for the investigation and openly criticized the sluggish pace of the justice system. By 2022, 3 years after the crime, the case was on the verge of being archived and moved to the cold case unit in Nantes. Desperate, the sisters decided to take matters into their own hands. In October 2023, they launched a crowdfunding campaign on Liegi to raise funds to hire a private investigator, no longer believing the authorities would solve the case. Their initial goal was to raise between 10,000 and 15,000 euros, but within just 24 hours, they had already collected over 11,000 euros, showing massive support from the community. The money would also go toward cleaning their parents' house, which had remained in a deplorable state since the crime and had been looted in 2020, as well as covering other case-related costs. Over those 4 years, Margot and Natasha endured deep psychological trauma. Margot described how the image of her parents' lifeless faces, mouths and eyes wide open, frozen in terror, haunted her constantly. She said she forced herself to keep going to honor their memory, though she often wondered how she hadn't lost her mind. Natasha, on the other hand, fell into a state of deep denial, unable to cry for months as her mind blocked out the pain. The sisters also avoided visiting their parents' grave, fearing they might find something disturbing. A dead dog had once been left there, making them believe the killer might still be watching them. Still, they kept fighting, determined to find answers to the two questions that echoed endlessly in the minds. Who did this and why? In October 2023, after 4 long years of investigation, a breakthrough finally came. The DNA found under Sylviane's fingernails, collected back in 2019, was reanalyzed and compared to samples from the neighborhood. To the investigators' surprise, it matched. The DNA belonged to David de Weersch, the Muller's neighbor who lived directly across the street. He had submitted his DNA in September 2020, but it was never tested. He simply wasn't considered a strong enough suspect at the time. On November 13th, 2023, French police surrounded David's house in Galgon, where he had been living since his divorce, and arrested him. He didn't resist and was placed in custody for 96 hours of interrogation. For the first 2 days, David denied everything, but when confronted with the evidence, the DNA under Sylviane's nails and a shoe sole found in his home that matched one left at the crime scene, he ran out of options. On November 15th, 2023, after 5 rounds of questioning, David finally confessed. He told the police that he had killed Sylviane and Jean-Claude Muller. He was formally charged with murder and placed in pretrial detention. David de Weersch had lived directly across from the Mullers and had always seemed above suspicion. On the night of the murders, he had even approached Natasha, who was in shock, and offered her towels to wipe the blood off. Days later, David gave an interview to a TV channel claiming he was shocked by what had happened to his neighbors. Everyone around him, neighbors, acquaintances, even friends, was stunned when they learned he was the one responsible for the crime. David had actually been questioned back in September 2020, nearly a year after the murders. He even provided a DNA sample and told investigators that he had been asleep the night of the crime while his wife watched TV. When questioned, David's wife confirmed his alibi. Because David seemed harmless and had no criminal record, his DNA sample was shelved and never analyzed, an oversight that would prove to be a costly mistake. News of his arrest brought a wave of mixed emotions for Margot and Natasha. Relief that the killer had finally been identified, and outrage that it had taken 4 years, even though the DNA had been available since 2020. The delay in identifying David sparked serious criticism. During the 2020 global health crisis, the neighborhood interviews were suspended, and the DNA analysis was neglected. By the time David was questioned in September 2020, he had already had time to build a solid alibi. As previously mentioned, his wife confirmed he was home that night, but since they slept in separate rooms, she couldn't be sure whether he had left during the night. Because David appeared to be an ordinary man with no criminal history, investigators dismissed the importance of his DNA sample and left it untouched for 3 years. That failure allowed a dangerous killer to walk free for 4 years, living just 30 minutes from the crime scene. To fully understand this case and the disturbing context behind the crime, we need to take a closer look at David de Weersch himself. David was born on February 25, 1970, in Gironde, and was 49 years old at the time of the murders in 2019. He lived at number 21 on Rue Saint-Jean, directly across the street from the Muller's home, and had been there for over 15 years. David had been married for 20 years and had 2 children, who were between 20 and 24 years old at the time. He worked as an employee at a transportation company with a routine that started at 4 a.m. and ended around noon. To all his neighbors, David seemed like your average guy. Quiet, unremarkable, someone who blended into the background. He had no criminal record and was described as someone who never drew attention to himself. By 2019, his marriage was falling apart. He and his wife were already sleeping in separate rooms, and according to reports, David had grown increasingly isolated. In 2022, 3 years after the crime, his wife filed for divorce. David moved to Galgon, a town about 30 minutes from Icines, where he bought a house and began living alone. His children would visit occasionally. His relationship with the Mullers was virtually non-existent. They greeted each other in passing, maybe exchanged New Year's messages, but there was no real connection. The Mullers had never invited the Dawirs into their home, and David never showed any public interest in the family, at least not openly. But behind that facade of an ordinary man, David was hiding deeply disturbing secrets. According to later investigations, he had a dark side no one knew about. He had been obsessed with Sylviane Muller for years, to the point of spying on her and developing twisted fantasies. On his computer, police found deeply disturbing search history going back to 2014, 5 years before the murders. David also had a history of voyeurism and extreme fetishes, including violent videos and images. Mental health experts described him as a twisted, frustrated man with schizoid personality traits. Cold, emotionally detached, and incapable of forming healthy human connections. This was the man who had lived silently across from the Mullers for over a decade, watching them without ever being seen. After David's confession, investigators began piecing together his motives. During interrogations, he gave a version that was widely disputed. He claimed it was a crime of passion, saying he acted on impulse when he saw Sylviane that night. According to him, he and Jean-Claude argued. He pushed Jean-Claude, who pushed him back, which led David to attack him with a knife. Then, he also attacked Sylviane, who he said was collateral damage. But nobody believed that story. Investigators knew the crime was premeditated and that Sylviane was the main target. Later, David admitted he'd been obsessed with Sylviane for years, spying on her and fantasizing about her. Besides watching Sylviane in secret, he also observed her daughters, Margot and Natasha, growing increasingly frustrated that Sylviane never noticed him. The violence against Sylviane was the twisted fulfillment of his sick fantasies, while Jean-Claude was killed simply because he was in the way. On April 11th, 2024, David was taken back to the Muller's house for a crime reconstruction. During the process, he appeared cold and uncooperative, sticking to his crime of passion story. He described the events mechanically, showing no remorse, and his explanations didn't match the evidence, like the bloodstain patterns. Investigators concluded David had planned the crime in advance, driven by his obsession with Sylviane and a desire to exert power and control over her. The reconstruction confirmed he acted alone, entering the house through the unlocked door and surprising the couple while they slept. Though David refused to fully cooperate for an accurate reconstruction, investigators pieced together an approximate timeline of that night. According to authorities, David pretended to be asleep in his room while his wife watched TV in another. That night, fueled by years of sick fantasies about Sylviane, David decided to act. He grabbed a hunting knife, slipped it into his pocket, and silently crossed the street under the cover of darkness. The street light in front of their houses was out, making it easier for him to sneak in unseen. The Muller's front door wasn't locked, a detail Sylviane and Jean-Claude overlooked, never feeling threatened. David entered the house and headed straight to the couple's bedroom. What happened next was a brutal crime. David turned on the bedroom light. He wanted to see every detail of what he was about to do. Sylviane and Jean-Claude, who were sleeping, woke up startled and confused. Before they could react, David attacked Jean-Claude first, delivering over 20 stab wounds, 10 directly to the heart. Jean-Claude screamed in pain but was quickly overpowered and died within minutes. Sylviane tried to defend herself. She likely recognized David, her neighbor, but had no time to understand why he was attacking. David stabbed her 43 times, mostly around the chest area, also striking her face, torso, and intimate parts. Sylviane fought fiercely. Defensive wounds on her arms and hands show she resisted, and she even scratched David, leaving her DNA under his nails. That evidence, as we know, was crucial to catching David. But the horror didn't end there. After killing the couple, David took his twisted fantasies even further. He ripped open Sylviane's chest and violated her, using the baby monitor on the bedside table, a device that belonged to the couple's granddaughter. Investigators couldn't determine if the abuse happened before or after Sylviane's death, but the brutality shocked even the most seasoned officers. David also moved the bodies as if staging the scene. He partially undressed Sylviane, cut her underwear, and placed it around Jean-Claude's arm, a final act investigators saw as a cruel taunt. The bedroom was soaked in blood. Walls, floor, and ceiling splattered, showing the rage of the attack. After the crime, David tried to cover his tracks. He went to the kitchen, grabbed some of Sylviane's personal items, a throat brace and a handbag, and placed them in the oven, attempting to burn them. He also slashed the tires of Sylviane and Jean-Claude's cars in one final act of violence. However, the fire didn't spread, and the flames were quickly extinguished, leaving the items only partially damaged. That burnt smell was what Margot noticed when she entered the house. Exhausted, David sat down on the Mullers' living room sofa and stayed there overnight before quietly returning to his own home around 5 a.m. the next morning without being seen. He discarded his blood-stained clothes and shoes, likely Kappa brand since a matching shoe sole was found at the scene, and carried on with his life as if nothing had happened. Authorities also believe David was responsible for placing a dead dog on the Mullers' grave. Sylviane loved dogs, and David knew it. This cruel act was meant to torment the woman who was no longer alive. David's hatred for Sylviane was beyond normal. Despite having taken her life, he still thought of ways to hurt her even after death. It's likely he also planned to target her daughters, Natasha and Margot. But since they lived elsewhere, he gave up on that. David remains in pretrial detention awaiting trial, though no date has been set yet. Under French law, if convicted of all charges, he could face life imprisonment. The victim's family feels relief at his arrest, as do the residents of the small town of Ezines, who lived in fear for years, believing the killer might strike again. Despite the police's earlier mistake, David Douwirs was finally caught, and it's expected he will spend the rest of his days behind bars.